Welcome. Thank you all for coming. For those of you who were not here last week, I'm Dr. Williams. I teach at Trinity Classical School, a bunch of really rowdy and wonderful sixth graders. And I studied philosophy at Baylor, and my emphasis was Kierkegaard, who's a Danish philosopher. But I have been reading the Inklings since high school, and I discovered Chesterton slightly later. I remember Lewis was my first encounter, and it was like my world changed, and I would rush home from high school and say no to hanging out with friends so I could read Miracles and Mere Christianity, and wanted someone to find that I could talk to about it. So as I discovered each of the actors in the Inklings, it was like finding a new friend, and Chesterton is no exception to that rule. My biggest experience with him, just to give you sort of my personal encounter, is when I taught my first class at Baylor. I was given the task of teaching critical thinking, which is interesting because usually the way it's taught is you teach the students lots of logical rules, logical fallacies, things they're supposed to avoid. But critical thinking textbooks tend to tell students to be skeptical of any kind of authority, any kind of religious authority, any kind of tradition, any kind of community. It's sort of think for yourself, use your reason alone, and watch out for everyone else who is trying to fool you. And I wanted to not teach critical thinking that way. I wanted to teach the students how to think about authority and tradition and community and all these things as a potentially positive asset to their thinking, but something that they have to also think through. What authority am I going to look to? What community? What tradition? And so Orthodoxy was the book that I had, one of the books that I had the students read in this critical thinking class, and it was a fantastic way for us to have that discussion, because Chesterton in this book is talking about a way that we can see tradition in a positive light, and authority and the imagination. Another thing in critical thinking textbooks is you sort of hold all emotions and poetry and imagination in suspicion, and you think almost like Spock in a very rational way. And so Chesterton is a really good antidote to that, because he wants the person to think with their whole self, so which we're going to talk about tonight. So that was my experience with Chesterton, and I just had so much fun with him. He's a hilarious writer. Raise your hand if you have read Chesterton. Okay, so I have not read a lot of his fiction. I've read a lot, for the majority of his big philosophical works, and even those are full of paradoxes and clever aphorisms, and he's just a delight to read, and every time you read him you find another joke that he's made that you missed the first time. And he also was known, and I appreciate this, he was known by the people that he debated, because he had a lot of public debates during his lifetime with famous atheists and agnostics. He was known for being loved by the people he debated in public, and so he has a sort of comic, it almost can read as mocking tone to his writings, but there's almost just a playful bumblingness to him that was, I think, endearing to the people that he debated, and made the things that he said easy to receive and easy to think through. He was known for getting lost often in the city. He was definitely the mindless professor, so he would call his wife at random times and say, "I'm at this train station, where should I be?" To which she would often say, "You should be home right now." And so he credits his wife with putting his life in sort of an organization that it would not have had otherwise. So just a little bit about his life. He was born in London, in England, in 1874. So a good deal after George MacDonald, who we talked about last week. He was the son of a man who did real estate, but who had sort of grand ambitions of himself being an artist, and was sort of steered away from that by his family. And so his father in certain ways lived through his son by sort of pushing him later on to go to art school, which I'll talk about in a second. But so his father was a real estate agent. His mother was a strong personality, and there were 2 sons and a sister. When Gilbert is his name, when Chesterton was 2, his older sister died, and so or 2 or 3. So that was one of the tragedies of his otherwise extremely happy childhood. And his parents were Unitarians. They interestingly had him baptized into the church when he was either 2 months old, very, very young. But they were Unitarians, which meant they basically believed that every single religion is right in its own way as a way to being saved through God. And they were sort of regular old style liberals. So they believed in the progress of the human beings, that everyone's generally moving from primitive kind of conservative religion to enlightened, religionless, more ethical sort of system of being, and that sort of a progress that like human beings are on their way. Every age is a little bit better than the next. I think Chesterton said that his father often said he was surprised when a later age was more theologically rich than an earlier age, because he was of the opinion that theology was always declining. That's just what happens throughout the course of history. So Chesterton was brought up sort of with this belief in human progress guiding the way, religion declining, but also his parents made him and his brother sort of the center of family discussions and debates, and his father put a lot of attention into developing his imagination, created a puppeteer sort of station for him to put on plays at home, and so he was really encouraged, and he grew up around a lot of famous artists of the time, because that was sort of the kind of people that his parents hung out with. So he went to art school and was actually really depressed by that experience. He encountered a group of artists that are known as the Decadents and the Impressionists, and they tended to see all of life as this in a sort of disenchanted way, that the belief that there's real meaning, that there's real beauty underneath things is this facade that we've believed for a long time, but now we're realizing it's actually false, and there's really just a semblance of meaning on the surface. And I guess it's not that surprising that Chesterton found this to be a sort of devastating and depressing time of his life. And he, on the contrary, believed there was some sort of meaning behind things, and in a lot of ways started to butt heads with the artists that he was in school with. So there is a point at which he meets his wife, to-be wife, with another scholar says it's the unfortunate name of Frances Blogg, I think. So it's not a really great name. I guess I'll agree with that. But she was a wonderful person, and she did have a strong faith, and she brought him around to Anglicanism. So he became a Christian. It's sort of a slow, gradual process, and it was a way in which he says that there's this point at which it wasn't that there was one reason, because there were 1,000 reasons, and all of those reasons seemed to point him to the faith. So he became a Christian, joined the Anglican Church, and he wrote this book, Orthodoxy, which I think is his best. I haven't read everything he's written, so I may be wrong. Some of his fiction might be better than this, but he wrote this book, I think 1908, around that time. I know that what's interesting about it is that it was at least 10 years before he becomes Catholic. So it's interesting because this book, in certain ways, is more ecumenical, because what it's arguing for is a kind of mere Christianity and orthodoxy and tradition broadly construed. But that became something that was much more narrowed down to Catholicism when it was about 10 years later, in 1922. So that's when he enters the Catholic Church, and he was extremely well known in his life. Unlike other scholars who are only known after they die, he was a journalist, and so and you can kind of see this in the way he writes. He wrote tons of essays and tons of opinion columns, and was on the radio. He was on the BBC countless times from year to year to year, one of the most popular voices on the BBC. And when you read him, and this is something that I remember when I first read him in grad school a little bit more, I was somewhat frustrated with his writing style because it seemed a little bit sloppy. It seemed a little bit rushed in the way a journalist writes in a sort of rushed way. And this joke will work for this situation, but any stick is good enough to beat this opponent that I'm critiquing with. So there's a little bit, I think, of that even in his greatest works. But he has a great mind. He's brilliant. Obviously, I think he's a little bit ADD, which I appreciate, because I am too. So his mind is a little bit all over the place. So he wrote countless articles. He wrote mysteries. He wrote fiction. He wrote poetry. He wrote political essays. And he even, this is interesting, he wrote several biographies of various famous intellectuals, Dickens, and actually Aquinas. And a lot of Aquinas scholars actually recommend Chesterton's book on Aquinas as being one of the best sort of in-spirit representations of Aquinas's thought and writings. And I wouldn't say Chesterton read Aquinas that deeply. So it's more that I think he had really good intuition about people, that he could read a little bit of their stuff, and he got the project of what was going on, and he could outline it and sort of provide it in a really full way. So if you ever do want to know something about Aquinas and aren't going to go straight to the Summa, which I think you should, you can read Chesterton's work on him and probably really enjoy it and get something accurate from it. So Orthodoxy is really the book I'm going to talk about tonight. Another really famous book that if you have read Orthodoxy you might want to move on to is called Everlasting Man. And he talks there about this sort of, again, myth of progress, the belief that we're always moving forward. And in that book, he argues against that and sort of suggests an alternate way of seeing things. So, but this is the book we're going to focus on tonight. So, the argument of this book is actually quite difficult to ascertain because the way he puts forth his arguments is almost in a sort of spiraling fashion. So he'll point out one thing, and then he'll make a couple of sub points, and then he'll move to like his fourth point, and he'll make a couple of sub points, and then move back to his second point, and then over to his 10th point, and then back to his third point. And it's just, it's a maze. So you kind of want, sometimes as I read it, I would have to like reorder everything and put it in a kind of order. But he's kind of a painter. He wants to paint a picture in your mind, and so he's putting little pieces on the canvas and letting each thing sit in your mind for a little while as he sort of paints another spot. So for the logician in me, I get sort of frustrated, but I think he kind of wants you to feel that way a little bit as you're reading it, maddening as it is. So the argument of orthodoxy, I think in one sense all it is a explanation of how he came to the faith, and I think that in certain ways the first 3/4 of the book is an argument merely that Christianity, he thinks, is a healthier view of human life than its alternatives, primarily a modern view and a postmodern view. But I think in the last couple of chapters, he argues not just that it's a healthier view of humanity, but that it's the true one. But those are two different arguments that he would be making. And so I think that it's interesting because I think the majority of orthodoxy is really just arguing that this is more healthy for humanity, and then he sort of ends with, and it also happens to be true, and this is why, which is his own sort of, I think, comedy coming in there again. So what he thinks is healthy, and what we're sort of going to put it on the board sort of as we go tonight is he thinks that often, the problem in the way that a secularist views the world is that they take one thing and they see the whole world through that one thing. Whether it is that you're a pessimist and you see things as always getting worse, or you're an optimist and you see things as always getting better, or you're a materialist and you see everything as being made only of physical matter, or a mystic and see all things as sort of unexplainable. He thinks that the problem with all of these sort of versions is that they don't take account for the complex nature of the world itself. And he thinks that the world itself and life itself is often a combination of two big things that seem to oppose one another. Another way of saying this is just a paradox, that life is full of things that are paradoxes of two opposing things held together. So in orthodoxy, I would say on one side, he would say life is about the imagination and adventure. And on the other side, he would say it's rational, it's about the use of reason, and a kind of security. You might even say, along with reason, authority, which we're going to talk about, authority and limits and tradition. And so, in a sense, what he thinks is that the majority of attempts to define the world err in that they emphasize one side of these two columns to the exclusion of the other, and it ends up dehumanizing us in the process. And we're going to talk about sort of some of the ways he sees that happening. So look at your handout. The first sort of worldview that he's critiquing is what you could call the modern worldview. And you also could call it the Enlightenment. You could call it rationalism. You could call it people that believe in free thought, that reason alone is the thing that we should obey. And it's kind of, in certain ways, a belief that the problem with our ways of seeing the world is that our emotions cloud our vision, our impressions from our childhood cloud our vision. All of these sort of presuppositions that we have are getting in the way. And if we could move all of those things away and we could just think in this very logical, presuppositional way, that we could finally sort of get at the truth of things, and everything would sort of be clear. The world is mechanical. It's just a series of cause and effect. And if we sort of take out all of the frivolousness that comes in through emotions and faith and authority and tradition, then we'll get this logical framework that makes sense of everything. So that's the modern worldview. That's one that he would have been extremely familiar with, even from his parents as Unitarians. And so this first quote is his first critique of it. So he says, "One big and common mistake is the notion that imagination, especially mystical imagination, is dangerous to man's mental balance. Poets are commonly spoken of as psychologically unreliable. But imagination does not breed insanity. Exactly what does breed insanity is reason. Poets do not go mad, but chess players do. Mathematicians go mad, and cashiers, but creative artists very seldom. I am not in any sense attacking logic. I only say that this danger does lie in logic and not in imagination." And we should read this second quote in connection with the first one. So he says, "Poetry is sane because it floats easily in an infinite sea. Reason seeks to cross the infinite sea and so make it finite. The result is mental exhaustion. To accept everything is an exercise. To understand everything is a strain. The poet only desires exaltation and expansion, a world to stretch himself in. The poet only asks to get his head into the heavens. It is the logician who seeks to get the heavens into his head. And it is his head that splits. His mind moves in a perfect but narrow circle. In the same way, the insane explanation is quite as complete as the sane one, but it is not so large. There is such a thing as a small and cramped eternity." So what Chesterton's saying is that it's not the person who has an imagination, who has emotions, who trusts these things that are going on in them, that are sort of painting meaning or seeing meaning in the world. It's not that person that's actually going to go insane. That the person that will go insane is the person who believes they have a perfect understanding of everything. That has a sort of closed system. Nothing else is allowed into that closed system, and it all sort of works mechanically and perfect. And that's why he says that the poet only asks to get his head into the heavens. So the poet looks upon the world, and his imagination is sort of unlocked to receive what he doesn't know he's about to receive. He's sort of open to new things. But he says that it is the logician who seeks to get the heavens into his head, and it is his head that splits. His mind moves in a perfect but narrow circle. So it's almost the false belief that the finite, which is us, can comprehend the infinite, which is the cosmos and the universe and all of reality. And he says that the imagination, just by the very fact of the way it works, is something that admits that the finite cannot comprehend the infinite. It's a faculty that is always not done. It always is ready to keep going. And I would say faith in certain ways works in a very similar way. The belief in things unseen is a kind of way of saying the finite cannot comprehend the infinite. And so his first argument is that we need, instead of this sort of perfect but narrow kind of eternity, an open-ended one that affirms the imagination, affirms I think this is actually a quote. I should like know my sources before I say this, but Luther says that and he has a Latin phrase for it, but the finite cannot comprehend the infinite. No infinitum capax finitum, or no, I shouldn't even try. So yeah. The finite, we'll just do it in English. How about that?
We all speak Latin. Can you get back to us?
Yeah, sure. I teach Latin, so I should know this, but I'll work on it later. Finite cannot comprehend the infinite. And he thinks that if you reject this, and you have a single thing that you think explains everything, that your head will split, that you will be stuck in maybe something that makes sense, but it will be a kind of what he calls cramped eternity. He says that the maniac, and he likens the maniac to the rational logician who only allows reason in. He says that the maniac, or the person who's crazy, thinks everything he sees is a reason to prove what he already thinks. So if he's walking down the street and a person doesn't look at him, he thinks, oh, the person's not looking at me because they're trying to avoid me, because they're guilty. And then he walks a little further down the street and another person looks at him and he says, oh, that person's looking at me because they're suspicious of me and they want me to make sure I don't notice what they're doing. And so basically every single thing he encounters in his little world is proof of his paranoia, is proof of the thing that he is afraid of. And what Chesterton says is he's perfectly rational, that everything rationally lines up and makes sense, but it's this very tight, closed circle that's totally unrelated to reality. And he says that this is kind of a similar problem with the materialist, or the person who trusts reason alone and nothing else, that you have a small eternity that doesn't let in anything else. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So he also, and this is great. He also talks about the myth of progress, which I've mentioned briefly, but it's worth elaborating on. So I see this even in my field of philosophy and in the humanities, which is in certain ways the least likely to see it there. But it's just this belief that as time goes on, we're always smarter now than we were before. So you always want a textbook that was written the most recently. You always want to read published journal articles that were published the most recently. You want to know if this is the latest edition of your your iPhone or your computer technology. With technology, this happens all the time. And so what it tends to do is make you assume that everyone living and walking around here now has one up on the person that wrote 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago. And that as you go back, they get sort of dumber and dumber and dumber because they haven't discovered everything that we know. Which would make the Bible seem really primitive and naive. And would make people like Augustine and Aquinas and all of these people also seem sort of not worth reading. You want to read the person that's come out the most recently, the New York Times bestseller. And Chesterton just thinks that this is what he calls a myth of progress, and that there is no good reason to believe it. That in fields like theology, literature, poetry, music, philosophy, and just sort of in general questions about big questions, general big questions, that there is no progress. You get up and you start again every time a new person is born. Basically, there's no way to download every existential discovery that was made before you were born and to sort of start from there. So he says on your handout, he says tradition. He says it's not a dead thing. It's not a dead thing that we sort of believe without thinking about it. He says it means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who happen to merely be walking around. So the idea, and he says it in such a, the whole passage is fantastic. But the idea is that, for instance, if you're going to read, a chapter out of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, it would be erroneous to think, as far as reading commentaries, I want to read all of the latest commentaries that have come out and know what, John Piper and this person and that person have said about it. Nothing against these people, but he would say, you're missing it if you think that it's a good idea to ignore Augustine, Aquinas, Calvin, Luther, Chrysostom, all of these people that have lived through time, because it's kind of like looking to see what people on your block of the neighborhood think and ignoring everyone in the rest of the city, the rest of the state, the rest of the country, the rest of the world. And you kind of become isolated and it's sort of chronologically snobbish in a sense. So his argument against tradition, or for tradition and against those who hold it in suspicion, is that there is no reason to think of it as a bad thing to look and see what the tradition has said to these things, because really all it means is you're listening to more voices than those that just happen to be living right now. And I would say that in that sense, he is affirming this side of the dichotomy, tradition. In certain ways, it's a limiting notion. It's a belief that there's actual freedom in binding oneself to something. And so this would mean that if I was reading the Gospel and the Sermon on the Mount, and I got this really great interpretation of this one verse, but Augustine, Aquinas, Calvin, and Luther, and C.S. Lewis all read it this other very particular way, he's saying then it would be a good idea to question myself before I jump into that belief. That there's a limiting sort of power that tradition plays that's not meant to put us in a bind, but is actually meant to free us towards truth in a kind of sense. Does that make sense? Okay. So the other problem that he is attacking, the postmodern. So this was the modern that we just talked about, problem of hyper-rationalism. This is the postmodern problem of what I've called on here hyper-emotivism. And really what I mean by that is that in the history of Western thought, there is this time period where everyone really trusts reason, they really trust science, they believe all of these things are going to save the world. And then things start to happen that are bad. For instance, the 20th century, the World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. It's interesting because Chesterton's life itself spans, it spans a early, peaceful, kind of naive Victorian era, and then a very dark First World War, Second World War, sort of pessimistic, moral depravity kind of era of human history. So he's living through what really is, optimistic modernism, and then pessimistic postmodernism. And so during this sort of pessimistic stage of postmodernism where the world wars are coming, you have people like the Germans that are extremely well educated, and so education hasn't saved their souls, and they're still doing atrocious things. And so you have this kind of disenchantment with reason. Reason isn't the savior. It's not going to be the thing that gets us through everything. And so everyone's asking, well, what do we put in its place? What are we going to trust if we're not going to trust reason? And so this is why I put problem of hyper-emotivism, because really what it ends up being is what people prefer, what their emotions want. So it's either it's what your will is going to decide. So I create my own meaning every time I make a choice. That becomes part of the tapestry of my personhood. And so my identity is really just a series of free choices that I've made through my life. Or you have a pragmatism. So it's not that you try to do what is true, but you try to do what works. So we're going to just sort of not worry about whether it's truly real and true or not, but we're going to think about what's going to make our life easier and happier and sort of allow the most pleasure to the greatest number of people. So you have this sort of span of attempts to replace reason with something else, all of which I would say, Chesterton's going to say, are almost like taking the imagination and leaving the reason and the authority behind. So taking that sort of free-spiritedness of what he thinks was lacking before, but rejecting the binding oneself aspect that the rationalists actually did understand as being important. So here's the quote from the sort of beginning of his discussion on this. He says, "The modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues are gone because they've been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. Thus, some scientists care for truth, and their truth is pitiless. Thus, some humanitarians only care for pity, and their pity, I am sorry to say, is untruthful. For example, one has a strange idea that he will make it easier to forgive sins by saying that there are no sins to forgive. But his virtue would mean mere anarchy. Similarly, modesty has settled on the organ of conviction where it was never meant to be. A man was meant to be doubtful about himself, but undoubting about the truth. This has exactly been reversed. Nowadays, the part of a man that a man does assert is exactly the part that he ought not to assert himself. The part he doubts is exactly the part he ought not to doubt, the divine reason." So what's happened, for instance, is that the virtues, he says the Christian virtues, which are really, he thinks, a series of affirmations of both a sort of free-forming imagination and a sort of limiting reason. So for instance, justice on this side and mercy or pity. And we could say truth because he pits truth against pity in this quote. So on one side, the belief that there's a right and wrong, that there are consequences for your actions, that there is truly someone who's guilty, someone who's innocent, on the one side. And on the other side, mercy, forgiveness for someone who doesn't deserve it, pity for those who, yes, some of the things that they did were their fault, but there's also a lot of things working against them, and we've all been in that situation. So they need another chance. So he says, these two were sort of vibrantly, he even uses the word sometimes violently, held together. That they didn't mix together in the Christian faith as if it was like kind of soup where they both sort of fade a little bit and it's a grayer version of justice and a grayer version of mercy. He says they're both affirmed in their fullness and sort of their boldness, and that it's a paradox that only sort of Christianity, this is what he comes to find, can hold together in the same way that Christ as fully man and fully God is held together, and kind of brings seeming opposites together that we thought had to be held apart. So what happens in this age is he also says modesty has come into the picture to try to counteract the confidence that was there before. But he says that what modesty is meant to be is a modesty about oneself, about one's ability to get to the truth. And he says that what it becomes when it's emphasizing the imagination without the reason, without authority, without limits, when it's sort of held by itself, it's a modesty about the truth even existing, but still a strong belief in yourself being able to do whatever you can do. Does that make sense? So he says that he says that modesty is settled on the organ of conviction. So we're modest now about our beliefs, about what we're willing to believe, where it was never meant to be. We were meant to be doubtful about ourselves, and now we're confident about ourselves, our own emotions, but doubtful about divine reason, about authority, about something that would actually limit us. So he sees this problem in hyper-emotivism and postmodernism. It has no fixed telos, no fixed idea towards which it's trying to aim. So he says, he's basically saying that you can have this really fanciful notion of imagination and the need to move into the infinite in this sort of open-ended way, but if there is no fixed aim for that open-endedness, that it paralyzes you. It actually, in certain ways, takes you nowhere. He used a really great example. He says that to imagine children playing on a playground at the edge of a cliff. And this playground has fences put around it so that there's no way that the children can fall off the cliff. They know that they're safe. And he says that in that situation, they play happily, they just run around on the edges, they do all that they want to do. He says you take the fence down, and all of a sudden their play turns to a kind of timidity, a kind of fear. So there's no boundaries anymore. In certain ways they're more free than they were, but he says they'll slowly huddle together and sort of cower in the center, because there's no fixed telos, there's no fixed boundaries upon their play. And he thinks that this is what happens when the imagination and the adventurous spirit sort of sets out on its own without any kind of security, any kind of authority or limits on it. And I read that there was a study actually done on a playground in New York City where they did this social experiment, and they watched the children with the fence up around the playground in a rough part of town, and they played very openly and sort of without fear. And then the fence was taken down, and in an hour or a matter of sort of a certain number of minutes, the children were sort of huddled together in the center of the playground, sort of unwilling to move beyond that small amount of space. So the idea is that in certain ways, limits, another way to think of it is obedience, actually frees us to use our imagination, our adventurous spirit in the fullest way that we should. And so this sort of escaping reason alone approach is not meant to say that we're rejecting reason. It's meaning to say reason and imagination are both meant to work together, not isolated from one another. Any questions so far, or comments?
is all in Orthodox?
Mm-hmm. It is.
I have one, just Father Brown series.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of semi-autobiographical? Because the character's very much like Chesterton.
I don't know. Yeah, I would guess. Do you know?
Father Brown is based on Father O'Connor, who is a friend of Chesterton's.
Okay.
It's not autobiographical in the sense that Father Brown is Chesterton, but it is based on a person.
Okay, so based on a person he knows. I mean, I know that there is something that he does in his mysteries that works in a similar way to his promotion of the imagination in Orthodoxy. There's just this idea that when a crime occurs, everyone views it in one particular way, and part of what the brilliance of the detective that comes in is that their imagination just can step back and view it from a slightly different angle, and sort of everything starts to fall into place. He says that it makes the common sort of strange. They're able to view the common as a strange thing and see sort of these really normal things that everyone sort of takes for granted and view them as actually intended or meant to be there. And so then what's the intention? Who intended it? And they're able to sort of solve these mysteries. But I didn't know that the detective is also very kind of mindless or just... Does he bumble around and kind of?
They portray that in the shows.
Okay. Oh, in the shows. Okay. Yeah. No, I'd be really curious.
The thought occurred to me.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Okay. Any other comments or questions before we keep going? Okay. So turn your handout over. In certain ways, what we've just talked about is the sicknesses of the age, according to Chesterton, the hyper-rationalism isolated from everything else, and the adventurous or imaginative spirit isolated. And so he has a remedy, and he found his remedy, he says, from the fairy tales that were read to him as a child. And he has this really great section where he just talks about how people have been telling him that fairy tales are for when you're little, and when you grow up you won't believe them anymore, and you'll enter the real world and practical things will take over, and you'll see that those were fun while they lasted, but this is like where the truth actually is. And he says that in his experience, the opposite has happened, that it is true that the older he gets, the more people tell him that those fairy tales are false. But he says the more the sort of games that men play in the practical sphere of life seem to be utterly meaningless if you separate them from the truths that he's learned in these fairy tales. And I think that in a very similar way to the way George MacDonald says that that Lewis says that by reading George MacDonald, his imagination was baptized way before he became a Christian. Chesterton also was read MacDonald as a child, and says that in those fairy tales, The Princess and the Goblin especially, and some of the others, but then the fairy tales beyond that his mind was already sort of pre-shaped to be able to understand how the Christian view of the world makes sense. And what Chesterton thinks is that there's actually something in just the common human mind. So fairy tales are written often not by academics in the upper echelons of society, but they come through oral tradition, and they're sort of passed down through the common people. And he thinks that there's a kind of common understanding of the world that's a clue to the truth of things that Christianity sort of ultimately makes sense of, and that often the academics lose grasp of much faster than the common folks do, and maybe much faster than children do in a certain sense. So he goes through these 5 principles, which he calls the ethics of Elfland, that he learned as a child, way before he was a Christian, that he thinks sort of make a lot more sense of the sort of chaos of what's going on in the world than what he's found so far. So the first one This world does not explain itself. The natural explanation does not account for everything. There must be a magic. And I have a further quote from that. He says, these fairy tales were founded on two convictions. First, that this world is a wild and startling place, which might have been quite different, but which is quite delightful. Second, and before this wildness and delight, one may well be modest and submit to the queerest limitations of so queer a kindness. So, again, you see these two sides. This world is wild and magical. But there is a request that we submit to its limitations. One of the great examples he gives is Cinderella and the glass slipper and her chance to go to the ball. So he says she is visited by her fairy godmother. She's told she can do all these things, but there's a but. She has to be back by midnight. And she doesn't think at that moment to complain about the midnight rule. She doesn't think, oh, you're a horrible fairy godmother because you've given me a limitation on my freedom and my self-expression, and how dare you. For her, it makes complete sense that being given such a great gift there would be other things that come with that gift. And so he thinks there's always this connection in the fairy tales between something that's wild and magical and something that requires a submission to certain limitations, that often the characters get in trouble when they cross those, as in Cinderella getting back after midnight. So the second principle of Elfland, he says magic must have a meaning, and meaning must have someone to mean it. There is something personal in the world, as in a work of art. Whatever it means violently. So move down to this sort of test of the imagination section, and this sort of, I think, illuminates what the second point is getting at. He says, the function of the imagination is not to make strange things settled, so much as to make settled things strange. You cannot imagine 2 and 1 making 3, but you can easily imagine trees not growing fruit. You can imagine them growing golden candlesticks or tigers hanging on by the tail. When we are asked why eggs turn to birds or fruits fall in autumn, we must answer exactly as the fairy godmother would answer if Cinderella asked her why mice turned to horses or her clothes fell from her at 12 o'clock. We must answer that it is magic. It is not a law, for we do not understand its general formula. It is not a necessity, for though we can count on it happening practically, we have no right to say that it must always happen. It is no argument for unalterable law, as Huxley fancied, that we count on the ordinary courses of things. We do not count on it, we bet on it. We risk the remote possibility of a miracle, as we do that of a poisoned pancake or a world-destroying comet. The only words that ever satisfied me as describing nature are the terms used in the fairy books: charm, spell, enchantment. They express the arbitrariness of the fact and its mystery. A tree grows fruit because it is a magic tree. Now, let me explain what he's doing here, because I think he's giving a lot of examples, and it seems like it's almost flying off into there's no law, no rules whatsoever. What he's trying to say is that the scientific materialist looks at the world and says everything happens for a reason. There's this cause and effect process. When A happens, B happens. When B happens, C happens. And so miracles are impossible. Things out of the ordinary could not occur. And what Chesterton is saying is that there's actually a false assumption hidden in that claim. And he says the false assumption is that because something happens regularly, it has to happen. So because the sun rises every day, it must necessarily rise tomorrow. Because people die and don't come back to life. It could never happen that someone raises from the dead. And he says that that children actually sometimes are able to see beyond this, and they, every time something that happens regularly happens again, they laugh and clap and want it to happen again. They ask that it happen again. So my daughter, she loves the way light comes through the windows, and she loves the shadows that they make on the carpet in our living room, and it just happens every day that they make shadows on our carpet, and the shadows look kind of the same, but every day she's doing it a little bit less now that she's getting, to be 7 almost, which just makes me want to cry. But in this like 3 to 6 year range, just sort of like screams with delight when she sees these shadows sort of slowly moving across the floor, and it's like the greatest miracle is happening like right there in front of her, and it's beautiful. And she doesn't think it's mechanism. She doesn't think that, it has to happen. This is just a normal thing. In her mind, it's how delightful that this is happening. I feel like I'm in a moment that isn't necessarily there. And Chesterton thinks that fairy tales recapture that he thinks more accurate view of the world, where everything that happens, you're not quite sure. When you read a fairy tale and things happen, Rumpelstiltskin shows up or whatever, in certain ways all bets are off as far as what's going to happen next. You just don't know. You're kind of waiting to see how this world works, and there isn't this sort of all-knowing, I know exactly if you do this is going to happen. He says the world is built on sets of promises that when they're broken have consequences. He says that's one thing that seems to hold, and he says the other thing that seems to hold is that what he calls necessary truths. So he's not going to throw every law out the window. He's going to say it still remains true that 2 + 2 = 4. It doesn't become the case in a fairy tale that 2 + 2 = 5. It also doesn't become the case in a fairy tale, a good fairy tale, that evil becomes good or good becomes evil. So in certain ways it seems like moral categories remain sort of solid, but it does seem to be the case that things like gravity, things like life and death, things like the sun or a day taking 24 hours or whatever, all of these things are thrown up in the air and could be any way, and we don't know. And he says what this does is it's a test of the imagination to ask, is a thing possible or not? And he says that we actually need to look at our own world that way, because that's actually what happens in our world. What happens in our world is that sometimes that person that seems dead is alive, or sometimes we're expecting the sun to rise and it doesn't, or it stands still. And so he says that fairy tales sort of make room for this, but they're not describing an alternate world. They're describing the world we're in right now. Does that make sense? Okay. The third point of Elfland says the purpose in the world is beautiful in its old design in spite of its defects. So this is important for him. I'm going to just add some things up here. There is on the one side, he thinks a real affirmation of evil, sin, darkness. In fairy tales, I mean, if you read Hans Christian Andersen, whoa, it's Hansel and Gretel. One of the darkest. I can't even listen to those, some of them, because they're so dark. There isn't a. It's not a sort of fancy white nursery where nothing bad happens. It's actually a place where some of the darkest sides of human nature are revealed. But he says that the thing with fairy tales, and he thinks this is supposed to train our imagination, is that does not actually deny or negate the beauty and the goodness that still somehow remain and continue to exist, and even make it possible for there to be they lived happily ever after at the end. No matter how dark Cinderella's life with her evil stepsisters are, she actually still is able to live happily ever after at the end. She gets over her losing her dad. She doesn't have to keep seeing a psychologist. Something clicks, something happens, and you believe it. You believe there is a real happily ever after. And it's funny because people like become adults and their life gets hard, and they feel really upset that they believed some of these fairy tales because it almost, I think, makes them think that they were talked into a wishful sort of dream that isn't true. And Chesterton just says that that's not necessarily, they haven't necessarily been told the wrong thing. They may have interpreted it the wrong way. So they may have interpreted that it's in this life that eternal happiness is found. If that's what they believed, then maybe that's false. But if the promise is that eternal happiness is what you're created for and what's waiting for you and what you're meant to long for, if not in this life, in the next life, then it hasn't deceived you at all. It's actually created a longing in you that's never meant to be satisfied by anything in this world. And so he's not going to say keep those fairy tales away from girls because they will think that. I think they do tend to hurt girls in terms of thinking, well, you just find the right guy and then everything's fine, and that's not quite true, unfortunately. But if find the right guy means you find God, then that can be in a much fuller sense. So maybe we need to talk to our children about the fairy tales they watch and see how they're interpreting them. So my kids ask me a million questions about what they watch, so I don't even have to start those conversations. They just happen. Okay, fourth point. The proper form of thanks to it is some form of humility and restraint. Also, obedience is owed to whatever made us. So one of the things that he is sort of working against, or sort of warning against in this ethic of Elfland, is the belief that once you're given pleasure, you can do anything you want with it. And he says that it doesn't really work that way in fairyland, and maybe it shouldn't even work that way in this life. So, for instance, love is a beautiful thing, but we're told marry one person. Now we don't think, how could you have given us this great thing and given us this limitation and now it's all destroyed? We think there's something actually appropriate about being given a certain limitation to enjoy this really good thing in the right way. And sort of other similar things, that like every single thing comes with a set of, having children means getting up in the middle of the night and changing their diapers. I always thought God made babies especially cute because they're super hard. And so they're cute for a reason. They're cute so you will keep getting up in the middle of the night and during weekends of them being sick and crying and doing all these things. But it's because there's this limitation in this obedience that's being asked, but it doesn't actually harm the pleasure at all. It actually makes it more sacred. He thinks that there's something about the limits and the obedience that's connected with the wild and the magical things that makes the wild and magical things more precious than they would be otherwise. And he thinks that this happens in the fairy tales all the time. There's always a catch. There's always something that is connected to, you can have this, you can do this, but here's what you have to do in obedience to receiving it. And of course, Chesterton's going to say later on that this helped him understand the fall. that Adam and Eve were given the Garden of Eden. They were given every fruit tree to eat from and told that there's just one that you can't eat from. And they didn't think to complain at first, oh, like, how could you not want our happiness by keeping us away from this one tree? At first, it was totally fine. But sort of it was this belief that the limitations and the obedience were somehow keeping them from their humanity, keeping them from who they wanted to be, that made them want to eat the fruit, and to sort of separate the beauty and the goodness from the obedience that is meant to go with it. And it's then commitment to Christ that reconnects these two things back to one another, that makes that possible again for him. So the last ethic of Elfland, actually, before I read the last ethic, the bottom quote, every act is an irrevocable selection and exclusion. I think this, in certain ways, connects to this idea of proper form of thanks is some form of humility. So it says, every act is an irrevocable selection and exclusion. It is impossible to be an artist and not care for laws or limits. Art is limitation. The essence of every picture is the frame. If you draw a giraffe, you must draw him with a long neck. If, in your bold, creative way, you hold yourself free to draw a giraffe with a short neck, you'll really find that you are not free to draw a giraffe. The moment you step into the world of facts, you step into a world of limits. So, I actually have experienced this as an artist when I run out of a certain type of medium, a certain kind of supplies. So right now I'm out of oil paints and I only have acrylics. And when I think too hard about it, it makes me really sad and depressed. And I think I'm a poor artist. I can't just go buy more oil paints. But it's actually forced me over the last month or so to really get into acrylic painting, which I wouldn't have done otherwise. And I've been pulling out my charcoal, I've been pulling out my colored pencils, everything that I actually own that I don't have to go buy from the store, I'm pulling out to create these works of art that I really wouldn't create if I could just go and get any medium I wanted. I would be doing oil painting all day. And so there's something, he says, about limitations even in art that makes you do really incredible things with your imagination that you wouldn't do otherwise. This is why even sometimes, and I hate, I mostly don't think this is true, but even sometimes having art be your profession can be a spark to creativity, because when you are doing artwork and you know you have to sell it, you have certain, it's giving you limits. It's giving you limits. So you have to be done by this point in time. You have to get it to this person by then. And so you just start thinking a little bit outside the box. Well, how can I do this if I don't have this supplies or this thing or that thing? And you end up creating something that surprises you. You didn't know you could do it, but it happens, and it's because these other external conditions were set in place on it that made it possible for you to do that thing. I think this happens in writing as well. Absolutely. I think this happens in poetry. Maybe rhyming poetry is, like, by definition, this sort of dance between adventure and limits, because you have to have the word at the end of each line has to rhyme, but you want to sort of expand and say everything that you want to say. So he thinks that in fairy tales you have this sort of just way of viewing the world where you're never thinking, oh, imagination, that means no limits. You're actually thinking, well, to have the greatest use of my imagination, I need to find out what I need to submit myself to and obey, and that will allow me the greatest joy. Because joy is conditional, but that's actually the way that joy comes, is when this sort of, it's united with gratitude and obedience. So this last quote under Doctrine of Conditional Joy, he says, a box is opened and all evils fly out. A word is forgotten and cities perish. A lamp is lit and love flies away. A flower is plucked and human lives are lost. An apple is eaten and the hope of God is gone. The ultimately free decision is the liberty to bind oneself. Love is not blind, love is bound. And the more it is bound, the less it is blind. I love that. As a mother, actually, I love that. I'm bound to my 2 daughters. I can't go out and shop for new ones. We had a morning this morning on the way to school where, and even before school, where they're crying because their sock isn't pulling up just as easy as they want it to, and oh, my shoes are 3 feet away, and so now it's the end of the world, crying, and I can't just say, all right, Claire and Annalise, I want some other daughters that are easy, that will just sort of hop in the car and do cute things, and that's it. Those are my daughters. And the thing is that on the way to school, the prayer that we prayed after all of this catastrophe was so sweet and so meaningful. And the hugs that they gave me before they left were extra tight because we had extra turmoil before that. And so this just makes so much sense to me. Just this idea that imagination and adventure and goodness are wrapped up in submission and obedience and limits. And so I think that Chesterton, he calls it the romance of orthodoxy. He thinks that the Christian faith is, yes, it's about obedience. Yes, it's about laws. Yes, it's about things that you can't do, things you can do. But he thinks that actually increases the romance of it, that makes it fuller and richer in a way that it wouldn't be otherwise. So, we're ready for questions. I'm done talking. I'm ready to listen to you guys talk. Yes.
The statement that you just made about the limitations make Christianity that way. How is that any different with any other religion? They all have limitations, restrictions, and obedience requirements.
Right. That's a good question. So Chesterton thinks that he goes through sort of various different religions, and he thinks that in each case, in a different way, in each case, there's a way that it paralyzes itself. He thinks that a lot of the religions, and I would say we could just talk about like Islam, for instance. He's going to say that often what the case is that it's not.
Let's talk about Judaism, because Islam already has
some other things tied up in it. Okay, so Judaism's in some ways easier. So what he's going to say is that that most religions, or what he's found, is that they err by emphasizing one of these to the exclusion of the other. And I think what he's going to say in Judaism is that law becomes emphasized to the exclusion of grace. And so he's going to say Christianity doesn't reject law. It doesn't reject grace. It says yes, absolutely, to both of them. It doesn't make either one of them gray.
So I've not read any of his work, but from what you're saying, I'm going to jump to the conclusion that he says Christianity is the best balance of both the imagination and reason, given all the different reasons.
Giving all the options that are there, and I'm not giving him enough. I'm not giving his arguments enough of a stage tonight, because he actually does take them one by one. He says, here's this worldview, here's the Eastern Buddhist worldview, here's how I think it doesn't, take both of these in, and he sort of takes one by one and goes through them.
Well, you presented it in a way that makes me want to read Orthodoxy.
Good. That's the goal. If you don't own it, you should buy it and read it, because I've just given like a tip of the iceberg. There's just so much more there, so much more. And it, hopefully what it does is it gives you a roadmap to read it and for it to all fall into place, because like I said, it is a meandering book. He's one place in one chapter and he's another place there, and so I think
some difficulty with that.
yeah, no, I did for sure. But you also get these quotes. You get to them and you get it. Like it's like, yes, that's what he's saying, and that's sort of the key to everything else. Good. That's a really good question, though. Yeah.
Kind of a historical context question. I'm sure you'll get into this in the next couple talks, but to what extent we know Chesterton was really influential on Lewis? Mm-hmm. What about the other Inklings?
So I would say possibly even more so in Tolkien, because of their shared Catholicism. So I think that Chesterton is using the theology of Thomas Aquinas quite a bit, and that's informing a lot of his sort of affirmation of what you would call the thinghood of things, them having being. And Tolkien is doing something very similar. So I would say of all of them, I would say even Tolkien more than Lewis. That's a good question. Sayers probably with the mystery series. Yeah. Okay. Any, since I sort of opened the floor to artists last time, I kind of want to do that again, but any experience with this balance of these two being necessary or being important, the balance of the wild and the magical, the adventurous, needing to be kind of paired with limits and obedience, and kind of limitations, and this could be not just in art but in life. There's plenty in life. Yes.
Well, I see it experientially as an art teacher.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah, all levels, but even last high school, in that I see the most creativity when I have given these certain limits and parameters. If there wasn't something there, it's, well, I don't know what to do.
I've had that response so many times.
But
yeah.
I really, and a good art teacher can give great limitations in certain areas, and the creativity is like a pressure cooker. So that's, I love that.
And
I think the general public sees that as limiting creativity, but I have not seen that after all these years.
Well, and I remember, so I'm an art teacher as well, and I find the coming up with good projects for students in certain ways has to do with having just enough of this and just enough of that, because you can look up Pinterest sort of things on exactly how to make the perfect owl, or whatever, because our mascot is the owl, so students love to learn how to draw a perfect owl or a perfect eye or something. But the goal shouldn't be for them to come out and them all look exactly the same. Yes, they'll come home and they'll present it to their parents, and their parents will put it on the refrigerator and they'll be so proud. But if they all look exactly the same and you haven't given any room for his owl is a little bit more frenzied and hers is a little bit more cute, then
I liken that to craft and art.
Yeah.
I
Yes. Yeah.
Clear distinction, which drives me crazy.
Yes.
You've got a 5-step deal.
Yes.
But
Parents,
this is different.
Refrigerators love the 5 steps, but yeah, you need a little bit of openness. But the thing is, you can get too far over here too, where you just give them a white piece of paper and a pencil, and you're like, just express yourself, and that's it. That's good. Thank you. Yes.
I know also with writing, when I first started writing fantasy when I was a teenager, I had magic in my world. And I couldn't handle it because anything was possible. Like,
yes.
Could they fly? Could they disappear? Could they teleport? And that is, so I had to exclude magic from the world because I couldn't handle it. That's one of the things that Rowling does well, is she does magic, and that's what I think makes her series successful, among other things, is magic, but it's limitations.
Yes.
Kind of magic, kind of like a science.
Yes.
There's a magical world that's not just anything can happen at any point in any way.
Right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. It needs those structures. Yes.
When you watch theater, every production you see is going to be different. Like, it's going to be imaginative, but there has to be a certain amount of limits to it. Like, if they were just doing whatever they wanted, there was no stage, and no one would want to watch it because no one would understand it.
It's true. It's true. Even different interpretations of it, a single Shakespeare play, where they have the exact same script that they're working from, you can get extremely different productions. Yeah. No, theater is a really good example. Yes.
I know when you look at the Imago shows, a lot of the pieces are 2D art. One of the things that I mess around with is some 3D art with metal. And so I can come up with all kinds of drawings. I have notebooks that I keep next to my bed where I've got an idea. But then I have to take it to the law side where physics are going to, how am I going to connect
Yes.
the pin back? How am I going to fold it? How is the kiln going to work with this particular material?
Yeah.
So I can be imaginative, but then I have to come up with a way to make it work. Follow the laws, follow the rules.
Yeah. Yeah, metalworking, I can imagine this being extremely, you have to know.
That's half the battle.
It is. That's really good. What about connecting this up between faith and life? Any thoughts on that? My big experience, like I said, is motherhood. I feel like that's taught me this balance. Yeah.
So I feel like you could almost apply music to this as well. And so when you think about music, you think on the reason side of it that there's a structure, there's some sort of outline of how to play, and you can play that really flat if you want. But then there's this whole artistic side to how you shape the phrase and how how a more experienced musician plays versus, say, my kids who are learning piano.
Right.
My 8-year-old.
Just sort of playing the notes
Playing
versus.
so forth. And so if you look at that in terms of faith, the big picture of things, you've got kind of the outline of what obedience looks like and whatnot, but it's also freeing on the other end of it, where you're able to express the beauty and goodness.
I mean, absolutely. That's really good. It's almost like your relationship with God is like a musical dance, or where He's supplying the notes, and you're playing them.
The freedom to express.
Yeah, but you have to believe that you actually still play the ones the notes He's given you. Yeah. No, I think a giant part of my faith in growing, and it's still on its way, is believing that that limits and obedience are for the purpose of joy. That they are not there to destroy this part of life, but are actually there to make it even a greater adventure. And it's easy to not believe that on hard days. But there's this really neat patience, a patience in planting a seed, and you even see it in some of the heroes of fairy tales. The princess who waits a long time, that she actually gets the thing she's waiting for. She believes that joy is there.
I think the Apostle Paul sees that so clearly in his life. When I'm weak, then I'm strong.
Yeah.
To me, the putting it on the board like that with the balance just shows me, as I read the scriptures, how creative God was. He does set limits, and there are a lot of times, especially when I was a lot younger, that I thought, well, it can't be that.
Yeah.
And then as life moves along, you do understand He does mean that. And it's out of His love and grace that He sets those limits.
Yeah. It's really good. Yes.
So I'm a very visible person, and I can see kind of on the right side, like that's God the Father. And on the left side is Jesus our Savior. And the way you kind of make that dance is through dependence on the Holy Spirit.
Wow. I love that. That's fantastic. We should just end on that. That's beautiful. That's really good. Do you want to? Oh yeah. Yes.
You started off by saying Chesterton had the idea that just because something was new, in fact, new things are not as good as the old things. Is where you would go, right? And it's just interesting that we went through that. Our oldest son wanted to see some Bond movie or something that came out at one time, where he wanted to have some guys over and watch a movie that, at their age, we just didn't think it was appropriate. Well, what? Trust me, I'll find a couple good movies. So at the end of the weekend, I said, "What was your favorite movies?" "Bridge on the River Kwai, Dad." movie. That movie was, there were no car chases, there were no, naked women, there were no foul language, there was nothing like that is attracting the modern audience. But you see a lot of, I think, Solomon's wisdom in this balance too, and that there's seasons. There's nothing new under the sun. And we just have to understand that just because something is labeled new doesn't mean it is. Doesn't mean it's good.
Yeah, it's really good.
The time for maybe one more question, comment.
What I love most about all of these authors and people is their ability to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. For example, in that book, Chesterton says, there is nothing about an egg that would make you think that a chicken would come from it if you had no knowledge of chicken. He said it's more likely that a bear would become a fairy prince than an egg would turn into a chicken. But he's constantly amazed by the extraordinary of the ordinary, and he says that's the purpose of fairy tale. A river runs with wine so that we will be amazed that river runs with water on the ground that we can drink. Just, it's extraordinary, the creativity of God, and I think that our imagination is limited by our knowledge to some extent, but at the same time, our reason is limited by God's imagination. Every law was something He created.
Wow, it's true.
But out of all of that, just their extraordinary in the ordinary.
It allows for the fullness that it wouldn't. Yeah. It's good.
The Christy, I couldn't help but think of the, I guess the paradox that you brought up, about the sort of, the seeming paradox between freedom and rules are the not really opposite. There's I agree that there's quite a huge amount of freedom within the rules. Some might even say more so. I'm the dad of a new 9-month-old. She's been a baby as long as I've been a parent, and we're both about as good at it. Although she is getting better. Me, I don't know. But when she was born, she had total freedom of movement. I mean, even her joints were, my joints are kind of fixed. I can't do the splits anymore. But a baby, they literally total freedom of movement, not inhibited by any societal norms. She can do anything, and the contrast that to Misty Copeland, the prima ballerina Misty Copeland, who has probably the opposite of freedom of movement. I mean, she knows moves and stances and whatever the ballet language is for these things that I'm trying to convey. What? Positions. That's the word. Oh, my wife would be so upset with me. Her positions, and yet, whose activity would you say would, if you just feel more like what your soul would do if it had complete freedom of movement? I'd have to side with Misty Copeland. As inspiring as my baby's, it is to me. It's almost like chaos. And so there's this. I guess the current era seems to puts a whole lot of stock in the value of freedom, but every trained master artist that can show you what true freedom on the foundation of a set of rules can do. So that was just running through my mind.
So you're saying your baby could not dance the lead to Swan Lake?
I am saying she could. It would be a drastically different interpretation from Misty Copeland's. That was awesome. Just plain awesome. I mean, I don't know if you guys felt this way, but I just heard ripples of old sermons, that I've heard over the years, and books and modern theologians just coming at me from this guy, the realizing that he was sort of the pebble in some ways, and McDonald, the pebbles tossed into the lake that are still rippling today.